Hi, good evening. I'm Garrett Dash Nelson. I'm the president and head curator at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. And you're joining us this evening for our program called For the Love of Maps, Material Passion and Power in 18th Century America with Professor Martin Brückner. Tonight's program is part of the American Revolutionary Geographies Online, or ARGO project, in the Richard H. Brown Seminar on the Historical Geography of the American Revolutionary War era. Before we start tonight's program, I want to take note of the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place that we now call Boston is the ancestral and current home to indigenous peoples. The Massachusetts peoples lived for thousands of years and still live today on the Shawmut Peninsula. The metropolitan region of Boston is also home to other tribes, including Mashpee and Aquinnah-Wampanoag and the Nipmuc Nations. Copley Square, where the Central Library is located, sits on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in North America. The maps that are in the Boston Public Library's collections bear witness not only to histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts that range from labor struggles to racial segregation. And in some cases, the maps in our collections don't simply document these stories, but actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. Through all of our programs, interpretation, and educational activities, we encourage visitors to consider how these histories still exert real effects on the present day. Tonight's program is part of a three times a year series in the Richard H. Brown Seminar on the Historical Geography of the American Revolutionary War era, where we encourage folks to think about not only maps from the 18th century, but the geographies and spaces of that moment and how they shaped the stories of the Revolutionary War period. Argo, which you can visit at argomaps.org, is a collaborative project with our colleagues at the Washington Library at Mount Vernon, and we'll be joined tonight by Dr. Alexandra Montgomery, the director of the Center for Digital History at the Washington Library. But now I want to turn the program over to our guest, Martin Brückner. Welcome, Martin.
Hello, good evening.
Professor Brückner is professor of English and director of the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture at the University of Delaware. He's the author of two award-winning and excellent books, The Social Life of Maps in America, 1750 to 1860, and The Geographic Revolution in Early America, Maps, Literacy, and National Identity. His other published work addresses the material and spatial imagination in early American literary and visual culture, and he has long been on our list as somebody we wanted to talk to as part of the Argo project. In today's program, Professor Brückner will introduce us to his work and to a series of maps, and then we'll be joined by Dr. Alexandra Montgomery for a conversation, and finally, a conversation with the audience as well. You can drop questions or thoughts into the chat at any time, whether you're logged into YouTube or Facebook, and we'll try to get to as many of those audience questions as we can in the final third of the program. So Professor Brückner, welcome to the program, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your kind introduction and for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk with you about maps and the decades leading up to the revolution. For the Love of Maps, Material Passion and Power explores one aspect of my book on the social life of maps in America, in particular the rise of maps in American popular culture during the long 18th century. To illustrate how maps entered American homes and ultimately the people's thoughts and dreams, I revive tonight the much forgotten ornamental understanding of maps. What I want to call attention to is how maps operated as multiform consumer goods whose meaning was contingent on the materiality of maps and their material surroundings. For this, I will examine how maps were embedded, real and symbolically, inside physical places. Think architecture, the arts, think about prints and theater, and the material culture of everyday life, like furniture and tableware. In the process, I will show how maps were at the core of an emerging performance culture in which maps increasingly played a formative role, cartocoding everything from personal experience to institutional self-definition. And I'm trying to forward my slide, and here we go. Thank you. I begin with an episode of map culture in colonial Virginia, when in February 1770, the planter John Henry, better known today as the father of Patrick Henry, published a new and accurate map of Virginia, his first and only map. It invited a lot of attention. Consisting of 4 sheets, the maps measured an eye-catching 38 by 52 inches. Graphic symbols marking mountains, rivers, and habitations invited the eye for a closer reading of Virginia's geography. At the same time, the map's neoclassical title cartouche appealed to the discerning viewer versed in 18th-century graphic design. Blending cartographic and artistic representation, the Henry map competed with an older generation of large wall maps popular in the British colonies, including Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson's famous map of Virginia, or John Mitchell's masterpiece, a map of the British and French dominions from the same year of 1755. As with all conspicuous objects funded by private or public subscription, the Henry map was scrutinized by the media. In this case, the Virginia Gazette published a series of reviews which, in a two-punch approach, demolished the map's reputation and that of John Henry as a mapmaker. The first critique accused Henry of gross omissions and mistakes in geography. Rivers and whole towns were misplaced or forgotten. The second critique, Henry sought to preempt himself when he acknowledged he had failed to sufficiently document the manners and plantations of Virginia's landed gentry. The Virginia reviewers applied the same evaluative principles that have been at the core of modern and even postmodern responses to cartography. In the first critique, maps are examined according to the utilitarian expectation that they were at once scientific records and mimetic representations of physical and cultural landscapes. From the moment maps were recognized as lacking in accuracy, critics were quick to challenge the map's integrity and dismiss its use value. In the second critique, Virginia reviewers objected to Henry's map as if they were anticipating modern criteria of map interpretation. His omission of gentlemen's seats ran afoul not because of misinformation, but because his map did not fulfill ideological expectations, here about showing kinship networks and political relationships. Yet before we dismiss the Henry map as the quintessential bad map, it comes as a surprise that the Virginia Gazette ended on a conciliatory note. In a final review, the critic, after complaining yet again about the mapmaker's ignorance and mistakes, undercuts most of his complaints by reminding readers that he, quote, had often seen the maps hung up in houses, not because they were reckoned useful, but ornamental, unquote. By juxtaposing the terms useful and ornamental, the author unexpectedly broadened the scope of map evaluation, drastically changing the public judgment about the functional value of maps. The Henry map might be useless for finding geographical places, but it was considered quite useful when placed as an ornamental object inside Virginia houses. What is significant about the slippage between useful and ornamental maps is that it invokes two important map definitions familiar to Virginians in circa 1770, and in fact to British colonists throughout the early modern period. By emphasizing the ornamental value of maps, the author invokes a popular picture definition that dominated the understanding of maps during the 17th and 18th century. By the 1770s, lexicographers like Samuel Johnson and Thomas Sheridan had spelled out the long-standing notion that maps were geographical pictures. Secondary terms such as description, delineation, and projection fused the term map semantically to perspective theories and graphic practices. Textbooks and technical manuals associated maps as much with the tools of empirical science as they did with materials emerging from catalogs, selling copybooks, books about architecture, and pictorial prints variously called a view, a prospect, or a portraiture. With this in mind, today I will follow the 18th century picture definition of maps and explore what I believe was the prematurely dismissed ornamental understanding of cartography. My talk will proceed in 3 sections. First, I will talk about maps as commodities, second as display objects, and third as performance objects in 18th century colonial America. Let's talk commodity culture first. To stick with the Henry map, when it went up for sale in 1771, its publication coincided with a moment in American history when maps had established themselves as popular consumer goods. Before the 1750s, maps, and especially large maps, had already been available artifacts, but it was only during the second half of the 18th century that American map trade developed into a somewhat lucrative business. Newspaper ads and price sheets like the ones shown here suggest that map demand and supply had become consistent with a burgeoning marketplace that was flush with consumer goods. By mid-century, small single-sheet maps were regularly tipped into bound volumes such as geography books, histories, and travel narratives. American shops also sold hefty folios containing large folded maps such as Thomas Jeffries' The American Atlas. The less well-heeled consumer would certainly have encountered small and cheaply made maps in magazines and almanacs. Crucial for us to realize is that as map sellers stress the similarity of pictures and maps, they advertised maps not in the material terms of bookbinding or stationery goods. Rather, when maps were sold in sheets, they were sold by using the material terms of pictures and wall furnishings. Consider the two advertisements before us. As you read them, you'll find that a few material additions involving cloth, wood, glass, or paint change the map's commercial identity. In the case of a large multi-sheet map, cartographic pictures turned into oversized wall furniture. Mounted on canvas and attached to hanging rollers, they now resembled material formats that were usually associated with paintings, tapestries, or wallpaper. A similar material redefinition took place for smaller two-sheet or single-sheet maps. These maps were sold separately, glazed, framed, or varnished, and thus entered the realm of decorative wall ornaments. Once we understand that maps are considered decorative materials, I can now turn to their form and function as popular display objects in both the public and private sphere. My star witness for the public map frenzy in early America is Benjamin Franklin, who placed multiple orders for Henry Popple's A Map of the British Empire in America. Franklin's letters in particular help us understand how American colonists thought about the role of maps as public goods. Writing to his agent in 1747, Franklin requested, "I must desire you to send me per first opportunity the map I formerly wrote for, that is, Popple's large one of North America pasted on rollers, ditto bound in a book, 8 or 10 other maps of equal size if to be had, there for the long gallery in the assembly room in the State House. If none so large are to be got, let prospects of cities and buildings, etc., be pasted around them to make them as large." Franklin ordered a map that in 1747 had been widely recognized as a faulty product. Published in 1733, the Popple map had been criticized by its very sponsor, the Board of Trade, for inaccuracies and the misrepresentation of the British domain. However, a closer look reveals that the Assembly's motivations had a lot more to do with cartographic pictures than accurate geographic knowledge. As it turned out, the Assembly ordered not only the single largest map printed during the 18th century, the map measured 8 by 8 feet, but by using the Popple map as the standard for customizing an additional 8 or 10 maps of equal size, Franklin's desire for enlarging small maps indicates that the Assembly was less concerned with map content, but more with acquiring decorative maps to cover empty wall space in the public rooms of the State House. The American desire for large map displays recalls the material tradition of early modern map galleries that had been maintained for public and semi-public functions since the 16th century, first by European courts and later by institutions such as observatories and civic buildings. In that tradition, special rooms contained multiple forms of map giants, ranging from murals and wall paintings, like at the Vatican in Rome, to large canvas-mounted wall maps measuring nearly 4 yards wide at Whitehall in London, to marble floor maps such as the Bürgersaal on the right in Amsterdam's former Stadthaus, today's Palais op de Dam. Official map galleries had fallen out of favor by the late 17th century, but as Franklin's map order suggests, the map gallery had migrated at least in concept to the colonies, where it continued to appeal to audiences in modified formats. Giant maps like the Popple map were rare objects in North America, much more common during the period where public displays of maps such as John Mitchell's A Map of the British and French Dominions. Consisting of 8 sheets and measuring around 24 square feet, this map hung framed in the Boston State House. Further south, the Mitchell map was owned by the Pennsylvania Assembly, where if we follow Edward Savage's portrait, it is shown to hang above the Assembly's side entrance on the left, where it supplemented the Popple map, which would have been on display behind the viewer until the peace of 1783. Once maps became wall maps, they entered a new competitive field, the material world of wall hangings, interior design, and the attending rules of decoration. Their placement made them now subject to architectural do's and don'ts. According to handbooks by Thomas Chippendale or Abraham Swan, all visual features of a building, whether structural or ornamental, had to obey the logic of decorum. Decorum meant the keeping of due respect between the inhabitant and habitation, unquote. Decorations, on the other hand, could mean both the notion of due respect and those things in architecture that enrich or adorn a building, unquote. Samuel Johnson's dictionary turns the architectural definitions into something slightly different. Decorum means decency, behaviors contrary to licentiousness, contrary to levity, in short, seemliness, while decoration means simply ornament, embellishment, added beauty. If we return to the assembly room of Philadelphia State House, we can see how large wall maps performed the decorative work of creating a seemly sight and an atmosphere of respect. Both the Popple and Mitchell maps would have immediately attracted the visitor's eyes because they were the only wall hangings in a space that was reportedly rather plain, in contrast to its architectural neighbor, the Supreme Court, which, quote, was ornamented with a breastwork and a cornice supported by fluted pilasters of the Doric order, unquote. In 1776, the Popple map still hung beside the main entrance to the assembly room, impressing visitors, including John Adams, who wrote to his wife Abigail, "It is the largest map I ever saw, and the most distinct, not very accurate. It is 8 foot square." In this decorative placement, maps were intended to turn a skeptical gaze into a respectful one. Indeed, respect, admiration, and the implicit submission to the map as agents of political power have been identified by modern critics as the core modalities shaping reader responses to cartographic representation. Both the Popple and the Mitchell maps wooed audiences by turning the overt celebration of British imperialism into spectacles of silence. Yet, if large decorative maps were intended to foster political harmony through dramatic acts of reverence, their very display location would have also invited acts of irreverence. All we have to remember is that the Popple and Mitchell maps were hung in a room that was as much a political arena as a theatrical space open to public inspection. The assembly room provided the formal setting for civic affairs, including parliamentary-style meetings and courtroom dramas. One flight of stairs above, the long gallery, was a space witnessing social events in the European tradition. It was the stage for lectures on the arts and sciences, musical and theatrical performances, and last but not least, formal and informal banquets. Considering these settings, the supersized maps sponsored by Franklin were not only intended for public display, but invariably would have become subject to public debate. Franklin's initial map order was paid for by the tax-paying public. The subsequent map displays would have attracted citizens who were eager to inspect the community's cartographic investment in a setting notorious for noise rather than silence. Political cartoons riff on the public's vocal interaction with display maps. They show how decorative maps also carry the potential for indecorous social action. This is suggested by the satirical print Britain's Rights Maintained, where the figure of Neptune is stabbing the American map, while other figures cry, fret, and debate over it. Or as shown by the print The Council of the Rulers, a wall map titled North America explodes into flames while overlooking a political gathering in which the audience is losing its civil behavior. Men ostensibly belonging to the social elite are shown having lost their emotional composure. As far as theories of decoration go, public map displays certainly would not have lent themselves for creating settings promising social harmony. On the contrary, if it had been the intent that spectacular maps were to awe audiences into silent consent, the very maps that were put on display in public spaces like assembly rooms or taverns or coffee houses would have turned this silence into noisy, face-to-face debates, if not collective expostulations of political discontent. At this point, I would like to turn to the third element of my talk and describe the relationship between the commodification, display, and performance of maps in private quarters. For this, I return to my opening, to the moment when the Henry map was recognized as one of the many ornamental maps hanging in Virginia houses. By now, you can imagine how the theatricality that surrounded the public display of wall maps also informed domestic settings. In the specific case of the Henry map, the map's principal sponsor, Lord Winterthur, displayed a copy over the mantelpiece in the dining room of the governor's mansion. It turns out this was a visual statement of local political loyalty to the Henry family. Placed in this location, the Henry map overlooked the symbolic center of the governor's domestic space, a space in which private dinners intersected with political business. When George Washington attended a dinner party at the mansion, he not only saw the Henry map in its conspicuous location as an overmantel decoration, but Washington rushed home to purchase a copy for himself. On his way out, he would have noticed that Winterthur had moved the widely celebrated Fry Jefferson map to the socially less relevant parlor room, as well as several other wall maps that were on display in the hallways, staircases, and entrance hall to the mansion. Now, following this episode, the governor's house is a perfect example for showing the way in which maps became dramatic objects in early American domestic settings. First, between 1700 and 1776, wills and inventories show that colonial and early national homes put maps on display much more frequently than we have thought. Maps were found in middle-class homes and all throughout the house, in entryways, hallways, parlors, dining rooms, pantries, studies, even bedrooms. The inventory to the right is none other than John Ross's inventory, the husband of Betsy Ross, known of the American flag. Second, in private settings, map designs competed with mirrors and picture frames. Remember the picture status of maps? Much of the design echoes patterns found in 18th century material culture. In the example before you, the title cartouche of a Baroque map participates in a culture of material quotation, beholden to symbolic exercises of self-projection. Just think, when you look into a Baroque mirror or at a framed portrait, the framed map and the map cartouche mimic the very notion of self-representation. And that brings me to the third point. The map's internal energy is in direct correspondence with picture prints. As the cartouche of Thomas Jeffries' map of New England shows, the map's pictorial components match some of his best-selling fashion plates, ranging from historical to allegorical to simple, iconic motifs. And finally, in the wake of the early modern consumer revolutions, and you can pick your decade or century, there's the wide, wide world of cartifacts, of maps transferred to other media for the sake of creating novelty or sentimental objects. Large and small maps could be found as transfer prints on cotton for wall decoration and furniture upholstery. Another version of this can be found in map handkerchiefs printed on cotton or on silk. In the world of ceramics, the Meissen figure of the map seller introduces maps as an early form of kitsch. At the same time, maps emerged as a popular educational toy, here as gaming cards, so the education is not so important apparently, or in the other example as a pocket globe or as a map puzzle. And then nonetheless also in the form of a board game, and then of course as a map fan that you can wave at a party. Finally, the last but not least, maps also emerged as novelty furnishings in the form of parlor screens. And we know from records that the Virginia governor owned a parlor screen in the shape of a map, and this kind of map was also advertised in colonial American magazines. Put on display in American spaces of high and low significance, maps must be considered as objects of desire. But the question is, a desire for what? Decorative maps become material design agents that actively performed a unique kind of spatial work. They not only structured interior spaces, but also American perceptions of interiority. In American homes, the decorative map's function went beyond the picture. They were curiosity objects, conversation pieces, and educational tools. Processed by discourses of appreciation, conversation, or ludic activities, the ubiquitous desire for maps seems to triangulate personal relations with spatial representation. Now, all this has me now wonder, how does the constant contact with maps affect sensory perception? How do they affect personal sensibilities in domestic settings? As a visual and tactile spectacle, how do maps shape the habits of sociability and the logic of social rituals, regulating personal and communal relations? These are just some of my questions about the spatial work of ornamental maps in a culture defined by cartophilia. Thinking more about the love of maps in the colonial context is a very exciting place to begin our next conversation about the American Revolution and the social life of maps. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. This was really excellent. As usual in these programs, I was gawking up at my screen as with my face right up against the images. Of course, I'm glad you put up the cover of your book here because viewers can find much more about this in this work and others. I'm going to invite onto the program my colleague, Dr. Alexandra Montgomery. Dr. Montgomery is the manager of the Center for Digital History at the Washington Library at Mount Vernon. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the ARGO project, American Revolutionary Geographies Online, is a co-production of us at the Leventhal Center with our colleagues at Mount Vernon. Welcome, Alexandra.
Hi, Garrett. Hi, Professor Brückner. This is fantastic. Thank you so much for this talk.
So,
and of course, this great image of my boss, George Washington.
Dr. Montgomery and I are going to chat with Professor Brückner for a short while, and then we'll invite questions from the audience. If you have questions at any time during our conversation, please do drop them into the chat so that we can get them queued up to discuss at the end of the program. Martin, I want to lead off first of all with an observation, which to me is so useful in a kind of interpretive fashion about your work. I oftentimes will begin talking about maps with audiences that aren't familiar with them by encouraging them to go beyond the map as a sort of decorative backstop to something that they're interested in. I talk about the map as the cover of the book, and then you get into other things. But what you've so effectively done is to actually encourage us to take seriously that decorative aspect of the map that traverses sort of serious political history and goes into these circuits of common use. And this final question you posed for us here, props or prized possession, I wonder, maybe is a sort of why not both kind of setting. Can one really draw such a line between the instrumental power of a map and a mere prop? Are those two things really, in fact, as distinct as we might make them at first?
I mean, of course, that distinction is blurry, and I would think that I would never ever say that they're just merely props, because the moment you make the choice and you frame a map, that's already, I mean, follow the money is sometimes the easiest answer. And somebody invests in a map to have it put on display. And I keep thinking of the inventory of the Ross family, Betsy Ross and her husband. That, I mean, these were not rich people. These were really lower middle class, working class folks. They were upholsterers. And they framed a map and put it on the wall. And that was captured by the probate record. So it was meaningful to them as a useful tool, as a wayfinding tool, because it showed you actually the seat of war in New England. So in that sense, you could follow the news via the map. But at the same time, it was profoundly personal, because it also tracked then the whereabouts of her husband when he was fighting in the war. So these maps, when they are decorative objects, they fulfill more than one function. And decoration is just one of them. What I find more interesting then to think is, okay, what are the kind of not restrictions, that's the wrong term, but what are the rules that come with putting a display object on your wall? In this case, I kind of came across this notion of decorum, that your house is supposed to be in this harmonic relationship. All the interior design is supposed to be harmonizing with the people living in this place. And how does a map fit in? A map is such a weird object. It doesn't, it's not geometrical as such, because the squiggly lines of a continental outline does not lend itself for a neoclassical reading of a space. It doesn't match your window treatments, probably. I mean, it's just like this off color of something. It does something else. And so hence the logic being that they are ornamental, but I think we just have not given the notion of ornamentation or ornament the right spin yet, retrospectively, in the kind of 21st century hindsight, because we forgot. We don't realize that these were actually really meaningful to folks.
There was a passage that caught my eye earlier in your talk. I think it was from the Philadelphia Gazette in 1750, where maps were being sold alongside seaskips and landscapes. Of course, the predecessor words to seascapes and landscapes. And as a geographer, the word landscape is so kind of charged with meaning, and of course, a meaning that's intriguingly synergistic with the history of cartography. Landscape, of course, going from a form of administrative governance and territorial rule in Northern Europe to something which we now think of as purely decorative, or something in that exclusively belongs to the visual arts. And in fact, forms of cartography can blur into landscape and vice versa. I was curious, how does the history of landscape art and the history of landscape as a form of governance and territory, maps and landscapes being types of visual materials that blur into one another, how do you read that in alongside this history of sort of cartographic objects in the classical sense, showing orthogonally rendered?
The slide before us is actually perfect to kind of talk about this, because both the Washington family image, and then I think it's one of the Boardman family members, I think Elijah, the black and white image in the left foreground. That's where you have actually a artistic riff on how landscape and mapping impulse that comes out of Dutch realism of the early 17th century is really still strongly at work in the self-perception of how do you depict your property, the land that you own. In the case of the Washington family, you have, of course, the city of Washington presumably being sketched out for us on the map. If you lean in, it is supposed to be actually the blueprint for the city of Washington. And yet at the same time, in the background, you see the landscape opening up to the Potomac River. And so therefore you have like this it's a kind of moment of ideological, but also sensory coalescence, where people understand I am looking at a proprietary relationship with the land. I can own it, even if it's just in a pocket form as a map or as a landscape painting. But at the same time, the landscape we know is man-made. It's a construct. There's no natural landscape in the sense that we think is just in and of itself there for its own sake. The moment we call it a landscape, we are assigning it a value. And these maps are actually suddenly entering into this conversation of how people have been talking about landscape up to this point, and they are grounding them. They're grounding the concept of landscape differently. And I thought that's still something I feel like a lot of people have written about this already, obviously, but it's a fascinating struggle.
Yeah.
Because we get at this only from a Western-centric perspective. I don't have an indigenous map or mapping on display, so that would be the counterpiece to this in my mind, right? And how would you kind of negotiate that rendition of the same landscape we would be looking at?
So my question for you is born of the fact that I have both taught your book and occasionally used it heavily when preparing my own talk. So thank you so much for your work just from that purely instrumental perspective. But one of the types of questions I often get when I do my own sort of attempt to get at some of your points here is a lot of questions about, well, okay, what did it mean then for people, for families, for individuals to choose to put maps on their wall? I think this idea of taking the decorative seriously and maps as multi-layered objects is really, really important and crucial. But is there a sense in which someone who is saying, okay, I'm going to put the Mitchell map on my wall, as thing other than saying that I have a massive wall that I can put things on, is it a more acceptable type of decoration for some types of people, or is that just a sort of too pat, not complex enough to really get at what's going on here?
Oh no, I mean that's exactly where I felt like when I tripped over this whole notion that maps are part of maybe of a conversation about decorum in the 18th century. The Samuel Johnson definition that it's decorum is to be not licentious, right? Suddenly you don't have nude pictures on the wall. I can put a map on the wall and I'm not going to be offensive by having, possibly other images that people might object to on the wall. And so there is an interesting way of how this is actually triangulating. It's not Puritanism really, or kind of an aesthetic sensibility that is oddly prudish, because there would have been obviously images of nudes, whether it's goddesses or whatever, that was circulating widely. But maps emerged suddenly as a safe space in a sense where you could put that on the wall. So this is one way I can answer this question. The other way of saying it would be to say that very quickly maps advanced as a sense of self emplacement. So you use the map of your hometown, and what I found in diaries, actually it was not your hometown that you lived in right now in North America, but it was actually your hometown that you'd left behind in France or in Germany or wherever. And people had these maps as like a kind of memory aid, or as the last vestige that connects you to a place that you have strong sense memories or generally memories about. But the map is your kind of gateway for that kind of realization, but also kind of experience. And then thirdly would be to think of, and I'm looking at the children on this in this collage, that by the mid 18th century, certainly upper classes, and by the 1780s, definitely middle class white children would have been trained how to make maps themselves. And map drawings were actually part of school competitions. And people posted that at home. That was something people bragged about. And diary entries, again, would have dads or moms proudly describe how their little ones, and they started at age 6. I mean, that's something we can't even comprehend. My daughters, I think, had their very one hour of map instruction, whatever they did in middle school, and it was horrible. That's a different can of worms.
We're trying to change that.
Ouch. Oh, yeah. I love that, especially your point about people having maps of places they're from, just because I think I have 2 or 3 maps of Nova Scotia, which is where I'm from, up in my house. It's like this very familiar idea about how people are using maps. And yeah,
I
just
do this exercise. I was going to say with students all the time to say how many of them have a map on their dorm room wall or even on a sticker on the back of their laptop, and it's, you know, invariably a huge number of them.
Yeah,
I
so
was.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Speaking of this sort of, you know, our children at this period are being taught to be geographically literate through both map reading and map drawing. Do you ever encounter cases, or do you get a sense that for the 18th century first elite classes and then percolating down to the sort of upwardly mobile middle classes, is there a sense that the map on the wall does form a kind of like taste discrimination of, you know, not everybody can read and interpret a map, that it's, you know, I think about like the 19th century purchase of encyclopedias in American households as a kind of marker of this is a household that can read encyclopedias. Is there a sense of, you know, this is a household that could read maps. This is a household that is educated enough, that would be geographically literate, and the act of decorating with a map is a proof of that?
That is one answer, and I've initially bought into that myself, but I'm increasingly suspicious. And again, it comes down to what you find in the probate records, that people who are barely having any property that they can give away at the end of their lives, they still would have a map on their wall.
Interesting.
So that is actually slightly more than me trying to be, you know, in the Thorsten Veblen world of conspicuous consumption, and I will imitate my neighbor, right? So I don't think that fits that paradigm. So
yeah, interesting.
It is not showcasing your geographic literacy. I think, and that's part of my very first book, was trying to show, no, people were geographically literate often before they were necessarily even alphabetically literate. Because you had to be able to read a surveyor's map, because your property, even if you're marked with an X on the dotted line at the end when you made a land transfer or land deal, you had to be able to read those maps to understand where are my boundary lines of my property. So on that level, there was already like a widespread map literacy at work in circa 1700 going forward. We know that the Mathers, Cotton Mather and Increase Mather, they were commenting on Cotton's Jr., and on his drawing maps of New England. And again, that was the intelligentsia of the time. But that was true also from households that they were not the Cottons, right? The Mathers, I'm sorry, the Cotton Mathers. So that is my weird moment of readjusting my lenses, where I keep thinking throughout the 18th century, maps were fulfilling more than box one, or checking more than box 1 and 2 and 3. There's something much more complicated going on.
Is there any phenomenon, I'm thinking about the, you know, the map as a political statement of, you know, of independence? Is there evidence of, you know, families chucking their old maps and, you know, purchasing new maps in the early republic after independence? Is there a, you know, would you have been seen to be, you know, sort of why have you got that Tory map on your wall when you could have commissioned a
what was that public map burning, you're saying, right?
Yeah.
They burn all these British maps just because. No, oddly not. And that's another thing that the archive reveals, that maps had actually an incredible longevity, and people knew they were outdated, but they were sentimental by that point. And they were, again, also treated as a wall decoration that was cheap. Fundamentally, maps as printed objects were infinitely cheaper than if you had an oil painting. You couldn't afford that. They were the same price as a picture print. I mean, so if you had but then again, they could be much larger than a picture print. So on that level, no, there was no massive turnover of suddenly people discarding British-made maps. And it has to do a lot with the experience that right after the Revolutionary War, there was a massive dearth of maps. During the Revolutionary War itself, again, Virginia is an interesting test case for that. The army, the Continental Army, had to send out folks to requisition maps from these country estates, these gentlemen's seats that Henry mapped literally 6 years earlier, or forgot to map sometimes. And they actually took the maps off the walls, saying, we need the maps. We have not enough maps for the army to do our own planning. So the print industry was basically on its heels, and it was not until really 1790-ish when Matthew Carey in Philadelphia kicks in and pushes out the first American Atlas, and that's when you see a massive uptick And I think J.B. Harley did the math once, and he counted like in the first decade, so 1790 to 1800, 90% of printed maps in the United States were only showing the United States or the separate states, but nothing else. I mean, that's when I think that was the big turnover, when people were really plastering the house walls with maps showing the United States. So there was no burning of the old maps. They kept those, but there was suddenly this gradual papering over of old maps with new maps.
Yeah. It's interesting to see even the, the rededication in a cartouche or something similar, that both the new name of the new country, but also, the removal of sort of, European heraldry and things, replacement with the eagle or the liberty cap or whatever else it might be.
Well, with that in mind, if you bear with me, here's my example of where you see this actually as a transfer in action. And this is a British businessman, or in this case, cartographer John Wallis, who drew the map showing the United States right after the Treaty of 1783, and creates a new cartouche with new allegorical figures. Here in this case, it's Washington with liberty on the left, and on the right, it's Benjamin Franklin with justice behind him, and he's taking note. I mean, he's basically writing the text of the new nation, supposedly. But this is a British-made map, and the cartouche is British-made, and very quickly, Wedgwood or Staffordshire is creating a porcelain or tableware, transfer printing that very cartouche and selling it to American audiences. So people are attuned to the replacement of what was the dominant iconography that you needed to show in order to identify your map properly. And Americans very quickly reinvented that and adjusted that. Well, actually, not in this case, British from within really figured out there's a market for this, and we're selling this back to the Americans.
It reminds me of the No Stamp Act teapot.
Yeah. And by the way, these images are all from the Winterthur Museum in Delaware.
Which, if any of our listeners, if you're not familiar with the incredible work that the Winterthur does, just really remarkable collections, remarkable work in material culture.
Yeah, it has always been one of the great institutions that libraries and museums look to think about how to work with materials like these. Why don't we turn to some questions from our audience? We've already got a few questions rolling in, and so we'll try to field some of those and continue the conversation. Feel free at any moment to drop a question in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Why don't we start with a question from Lynn Nallman, who asks, did the display of a map, quote, masculinize an 18th century space? How was a map gendered in a domestic space, considering they had practical use in masculine spheres?
Great question. I love it. So yes, on the surface, you would instantly say maps would have been part of the man cave, right? That would have been your study. You would have had your folio editions. You would have had, they would have been lying flat probably because your shelving unit was not designed properly to uphold large folios. And you would have had a special reading table possibly if you were really a person of means. However, what is really bizarre to think then is that already in the early 18th century, almanacs, ladies' almanacs also had maps in part as part of the print culture circulating. So were there maps? Well, now you have to start thinking, okay, what are the gendered spaces inside of a domestic environment? And that's when you realize, okay, maps did actually percolate throughout, or circulate, not percolate. They circulated in the household in ways that we just don't remember anymore. So again, probate inventories are your best friend. We find maps in bedrooms. And so that is definitely a gendered space. I mean, it's co-inhabited basically, but you also find sometimes maps in kitchens. So again, it really is, it's hard to say that there was a straight up what maps equals male domain or male education, because women very early on were also taught how to draw maps, and then in this case often as part of their needlework training they were then actually using map motifs in order to do their needlework. So, and again, this kind of begins in the 1750s, so anything before is more isolated. I mean, in the maps themselves as printed objects were definitely circulating, but the moment you're looking for a gender differential, the archive, what I've been finding, suggests that by the late 18th century and definitely into the early 19th century, maps were ubiquitous, and both male and female interest groups, let's put it this way, would have been equally at home and comfortable with maps.
If I can follow up on that, do you think that there's any way in which, even there's a sort of long shadow of the techniques and certainly educational settings in which gendered productions of maps took place that actually loom over us today when we think about decorative versus instrumental objects. I mean, I'm thinking about young men would have been trained in surveying and mathematics and
Correct.
geometry.
Yeah.
Young women would have been trained in needlepoint and other textile work. And in some ways, have we inherited those sorts of, map is either decorative or practical, instrumental, kind of out of those the sort of gendered fork in those sorts of training and technical productions?
That I do not want to go down. It's essentializing gender norms, basically.
Yeah, of course.
And we're creating a heteronormativity in that retrospectively. And again, I keep thinking the same map that would have been printed, and then if it had been redrawn by, let's say, a female hand rather than by a male hand, would have served still the same outcome, namely to demonstrate skill. Skill of drawing in this case, but also skill of math, because often you had to recalculate. I mean, the Winterthur Library has a great map that was actually hand drawn by a woman, and she had to she redrew everything. Initially, it looks like it's a transfer, like a copy of a map, but no, this person actually recalculated all the coordinates and really drew the map according to coordinates, which is an insane task when you try to think about that. But again, so that was much more than a way of showcasing, women were equally mathematically adept or could also work as land surveyors, and that was actually true. I mean, even in the 1720s and 1730s already, I think the Hempstead family, the daughter was assisting her father in doing the land surveys of their properties. So the maps as a gendered artifact, I think the only place where that might really lend itself for a kind of, it's a superficial statement, but it kind of unfortunately works, is to say that when it comes down to the materiality itself, you find a lot of more objects that are then in the textile work that use textiles to duplicate a map or represent a map-like image. Men would have not done that in that context. They would, on the other hand, they would have done scrimshaw etching, right? I mean, they would have engraved powder horns, and so then it becomes an art form, right?
Yeah.
Then at that point, you're using maps as an artistic expression to showcase your local loyalty or your regional pride, and then you use whatever medium you have available.
It's actually a really nice segue to another question from Pam Cooper Durant, who is interested in maps and fabric, but says that it can be frustrating to try to figure out, presumably from a library catalog, whether a map is on linen or if it's a paper map that's backed by linen. Do you have any hints? Sometimes I find things listed under cotton or silk, but the catalogs I have access to aren't always specific.
Right, and that's exactly where the catalogs, I mean, I'm glad when they actually capture the fact that the map was on cotton as opposed to silk, but the linen backing or not. The same for my wall maps when they are cloth backed. At this point, I actually only use cloth backed as a term because it could be linen, it could be cotton. Unless I see the actual artifact, I wouldn't know. And so, sorry, so the archive itself usually, at least until fairly recently, will not yield a more specific explanation. On the other hand, if you ever get a chance to actually go to the archive, and people are usually very glad to have you, and then you can actually look at this, and then you can encourage them to update their records, because that would be really helpful for us down the road. Thank you.
And I would say there's certainly an interest amongst curators and interpreters to identify collections of works on fabric. We, in fact, maybe about a year ago now, we have a bi-weekly open collections showing, and we had one dedicated to maps that were executed in various forms of fabric. So it may not be obvious in a catalog record, but certainly whether it's in a finding aid or an exhibition catalog, I know there's a growing interest in assembling collections of cartographic works on fabric. There's some more questions coming in, and then of course Alexandra, feel free to jump in at any point if you want to extend the discussion as well. Brendo Carvalho asks, nowadays people buy maps from their favorite series to decorate their homes, such as maps of Middle Earth and Westeros. Could there be any relationship between these decorative fictional maps of fake places?
Oh, absolutely, because it's all about your spatial imaginings, right? I mean, you are inhabiting the joy, I think, of a map is to envision yourself in these places, and then automatically there's some kind of play acting. I mean, you're imagining actions, activities inside of these places. You reimagine journeys you took in Middle Earth, of course. I mean, there's one long journey, right? And so those are the kind of maps that really celebrate the kind of it's not pilgrimage as such, but there is a longer tradition in mapping and map making that comes out of the pilgrimage tradition, and you would just try to document this. And I had mentioned powder horns earlier, so the same would be true for, you find many powder horns that show you the Hudson River Valley up and down, basically. And again, it would be militiamen, people who were fighting in the Revolutionary War or in the French and Indian War, in the 7 Years' War, and they would document their way stations as they're kind of traversing this landscape. And then in the end, you have this map. You put it on the wall, or you put it in a shelf if it's a powder horn. So yes, absolutely. So I think and I'm thinking of my daughter's room upstairs. She has the Marauders map from Harry Potter. She has Middle Earth and something else that I don't recognize from a different fictional series. And that is totally, again, one of these triggers for basically, living out your imagination and being able to enter this world. And that's what and I can't keep thinking back to the 18th century, right? That's what these maps also did for folks, that you could envision somebody that you are in contact with by letters, by mail, but they live, let's say, in South Carolina, and I live in Massachusetts. And so how do you bridge that gulf? And the map was suddenly this wonderful tool that kind of foreshortened that distance.
When do we start to see the sort of creation and display of these intentionally fantastical maps, like the Middle Earth or the Westeros?
Well, you would have Gulliver's Travels, right? I mean, that's when we have our earlier ones. I mean, even Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, I think one of the first editions has a fictional map embedded inside of, tipped into the edition. Before that, you would have had, I think by the late 17th century, Ogilby's Road Atlas was imitated for Milton's Paradise. For Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress.
Wow.
So we have those maps already kind of circulating a little bit, but those were really novelty objects. I mean, like one edition, which probably is a print run of 500, and that was it, and then they vanished. And then, I mean, actually, I wrote about this in a different piece, and then actually there's a long silence, and it's not really until when you have anniversary editions for, let's say, Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, but then it's the French actually who tip in these beautiful, amazing topographical maps of, Cooperstown and so forth. I mean, you could literally track the novel on those maps, and they're even designed using then the locations from the novel. So it's a hybrid topographical map and a fictional map. Then it really doesn't really kick in until, I think, at the late 19th century, when we have well, for us here in the US, it would be Baum's Wizard of Oz map, which is totally abstract. It's not, I mean, it's hard to recognize it as a map at first. And then, of course, Faulkner of Patafa County, I like saying that word. It's like, so, but yeah, so there was, it took a while for fictional maps to really become their own thing. But I think the baseline for why they're appealing is the same.
It's fascinating.
Do you find that there's any evidence for maps as the triggering not just these sort of journeys of the imagination that we've been speaking about, but I think about the the sort of dawn of the tourism industry, whether that's the Great Tour in Europe or we've talked at one point about the presence of Niagara Falls on maps of the new nation, establishing that as this natural wonder, which eventually people start visiting. I think later in the 19th century, about the kind of imagination of the American West as a place which Easterners are drawn to. Do you see evidence that maps are also doing that kind of work? Introducing people, say, well, wouldn't it be great to see Niagara Falls? Wouldn't it be great to see the American West? Wouldn't it be great to see this or that?
I mean, you could go back to Captain John Smith and his map of New England as
Yeah,
the
of course.
same version as let's celebrate the White Mountains, right?
Yeah.
And make people come over and look at, in this case, New England. Or then later on, you could argue. I mean, we know for sure that by the 1820s you have tourist maps emerging, right? That were showcasing the roads it takes you to get to the White Mountains or to get up to the Hudson River Valley. And by the 1840s, that is, I mean, part of the river mappings that come with steamboat traffic and then railroad maps as well. They were infinitely automatically tied to tourist dimension, but it was all about at the same time, foreshortening the distance, making you imagine yourself in this new place for better or worse, and whether it's colonists colonize. I mean, settler colonialism, basically, where you come in and you imagine taking up and over that land that is not yours, as opposed to I take a picture of this land, paint it, or you take a photograph later on by the late 19th century. The logic is kind of still the same. You take possession of of this distant place that is not yours. And these maps are definitely part of that equation. I mean, so don't get me wrong, right? This is not like this kumbaya moment of, oh, maps are just these wonderful intellectual or imaginative tools and devices that help me think differently and better, perhaps, but they are also profoundly political all the time. They're always in the service of the prospect is also prospecting, right? That you want to take over a land that you look at.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. We're approaching the top of the hour, so I just want to say a couple of things in conclusion. First, if you've been following along and you registered for today's event, we'll be sending you a brief feedback form. We'd love to know what you'd like to see in the future as we plan the Brown Seminar Series for 2025. We'll also be posting this recorded seminar online on argomaps.org, paired with selections from the Argo Maps collection, some of which you've seen in Professor Brückner's talk. You'll be able to zoom in on those collections yourselves and explore them at great depth on your own.
Perhaps print them off, put them in your home.
Exactly. Yes. So the biggest printers can go even more than 8 feet by 8 feet, and so you can, if you're corresponding with Abigail Adams at home, you can remark on what you've seen. The program tonight has been part of our American Revolutionary Geographies online project, which is supported in part by a grant from the National Historic Preservations and Records Commission of the National Archives. We invite you to see more collections, read more stories, watch more videos, and learn more about what we're doing with Argo at argomaps.org. If you're in Boston, stop by the Leventhal Center anytime. We are open 6 days a week with our relatively new exhibition, Processing Place, How Computers and Cartographers Redrew Our World, which takes cartography right up to the present day and examines the computer revolution that has transformed the work of mapmaking in the past half century. We also have an open collections showing this Friday, October 25th, called Out with the Old, In with the New, where we look at comparisons between older and newer maps made with radically different techniques. But to close, please join me in thanking Professor Martin Brückner for joining us this evening. I encourage you to pick his book up out of the library or to buy it for yourself. It rewards further reading, and you'll find many of the themes that we discussed today discussed at much greater length in that work. Professor Brückner, thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Alexandra, take care. I'll see you soon at the next Brown Series seminar for Argo.
Absolutely. And thank you all so much for joining us.